Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how's it going today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. Thanks so much for asking. This is a special episode that we are bringing back into the public sphere. We want them to revisit this topic and this guest because, Tim, we have a proverbial crawl space of episodes that we just crawl through and we pick them from the dark with our little miner's cap on and our light, and we see it and we're like, oh, here's Lou Valoze. We haven't had the public hear him in a little while, and we pluck it from the crawl space, and that is what we're doing here. But what I want to pluck from the universe here is your mood. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, so some of these episodes that we've been replaying are older, and this one is included. It's almost 4 years old, Lance. But it was a great conversation, and our guest, Lou Valoze, speaks all about his life undercover. And boy, it is a really wild story.
I think Lou Valoze was one of the first guests that we had on who lived such a wild undercover life. And from there, we had other guests on who, like Scott Payne, for example, they would come on and they would talk about that. Or Carrie Drobin, who was researching with a motorcycle gang. Just these people who would fold themselves into other lives that weren't their own. And I think Lou was probably among the first that we spoke to who did this and would tell us these like heart-pounding stories.
Lou is a retired ATF agent who specialized in undercover operations, and he was part of the controversial storefront operation where undercover agents would pose as store owners and they would buy illegal weapons off of the street and they would turn them into the government, and subsequently those weapons would be destroyed. And he took a number of these hundreds of weapons off the streets. So he talks about that and really the amazing moments that he would have as an undercover, the dangerous moments that he would have as an undercover agent.
Yeah, I know for me, I'm fascinated by the new character that you have to create in order to keep yourself alive, and you've really got to stick with it. It's like acting on a stage with guns pointed at you. I mean, it's unbelievable to imagine going through this. A lot of my questions have to do with his nerves and things like that, because I'm just sort of endlessly fascinated by that aspect of it. But yeah, really impressive guy, really great podcast he does with his buddy Bootsy, who has also written a book. So check out End of Watch, and we'll definitely have him back on when his book is out.
Oh, we absolutely will have him back on once that book comes out. One thing that stood out to me that I want to make sure listeners are aware of is the topic of mental health. And I didn't think that the conversation would go in that direction, especially so early on. He speaks about the importance of mental health, especially with people who are in the situation that he was in. And this is a voluntary situation, being undercover, but it really does kind of mess with your psyche because he tries to stay so close to his own personality so he doesn't give up the act, and that really does have an effect on people, and you know the PTSD that comes from it. So I was really impressed that he's so focused on that.
We hope you enjoy this episode. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and then we'll play the interview with Lou Valoze. Welcome to the podcast, Lou. How are you today?
Doing well, sweating it out down here in Savannah, Georgia.
Savannah, Georgia in the middle of the summer sounds like an amazing place to be, to just, sit back, get some iced tea, and just soak up the rays. Is that how it is?
I don't know about soaking up the rays. I would advise staying in the shade or in the pool.
Gotcha. So it's a tad warm.
There's a little bit of humidity down here in South Georgia.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're an extremely busy person. You've got your podcast, End of Watch, with Bootsy and Sal, and your book that you're working on that'll be published soon, out for the public. And I'm wondering, like, I don't even know where to start with. Tim, I can't remember a guest that we've had where I'm just like, I don't even know where to start with this conversation. So.
Well, Lou, sorry if we're intimidating you here with our, ripped muscles and things like that. I can understand. A lot of people get intimidated by us when we have interviews, so I can understand if you're intimidated. But tell us a little bit about your podcast and what made you start that. I know your career is incredibly interesting, and I want to get into that. But why did you start this podcast?
I started it with my partner Bootsy, who's a former homicide detective and a combat vet, and we decided to start our podcast specifically for law enforcement and military personnel who have been through something, like Bootsy and I both have, who've been through a tough time, who've had a tough time, who've been out on the streets or in combat zones, and dealing with mental health issues and that kind of thing. And it kind of evolved into something a little bit bigger as we started getting bigger and better guests on because of our, the network that we were in. We just kind of started getting a bigger following of people who weren't even affiliated with law enforcement or with the military, but just kind of enjoyed the show. We were talking to guys like Sheriff David Clark, who we just talked to on Friday, the DEA Narcos guys, Steve Murphy and Javier Pena, some guy, Eddie Garland, who was the Navy SEAL, who was in the news real hot and heavy a couple of years ago. And, some of the pipe hitters that I worked with, undercover guys, Jay Dobbins, that kind of thing. And people just started enjoying it. So we just kept doing it.
Okay, this is a pretty good segue because you made the introduction into the topic of mental well-being and mental health and overcoming that after you've been through so much in your profession. And I just heard last night that a fourth Capitol police officer took his own life after I don't know if it's a direct result of what happened on January 6th, but a fourth Capitol police officer took his life. There's such a high rate of suicide amongst law enforcement. Where this process for you with the podcast is a way to communicate the need to address mental health in your profession. Is that pretty fair to say? Is that part of it?
Absolutely. It's, things have gotten worse. Politics has seeped into law enforcement. It seeped into the justice system a long time ago, which is wrong. The justice system needs to be independent and politics have no place in the justice system. Now it's seeped into law enforcement itself. And because of, what's gone down in the last, I'll say maybe 3 years, it's just gotten worse. Law enforcement, you're under the microscope now. And, everyone wants to judge and Monday morning quarterback and put you down. And nobody's thinking about the law enforcement officers themselves and how this affects them. And, because you go home at night and you got to try and live a life. It's a job. And you have to try and separate that and live a life. And it's become increasingly difficult when you have zero support from your agency or department, from the media, from everyone around you.
And where do you begin as an advocate for mental health in law enforcement? Where do you begin to address that on more of policy level?
You address it at the academy, first of all, right?
Okay.
The first week of the academy is where it needs to be addressed, okay? And the stigma needs to be removed. But there's complications when it comes to law enforcement. That's a little bit different from every other profession because as a law enforcement officer, and I've been through this, as a federal agent, as a gun carrying law enforcement officer, there's complications when you go and start telling people, what you're going through and problems you're having. The first thing your agency or department thinks about is liability. Oh, we got to pull this guy or girl off the street, take their gun away, and depending on what department or agency you work for, you might be putting your own job at risk by admitting you have a problem, right? It's easy, if you got a physical injury, you're always pretty well taken care of. But as soon as you let them know you have a brain injury, you might be putting yourself in jeopardy as far as your livelihood, right? So it's complicated.
Right. That's kind of infuriating that the first thing that is addressed is the liability issue.
Yep.
Because wouldn't you think that if you don't address it initially, then those liabilities get increasingly worse as time progresses and the condition becomes worse?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
No question. It festers and builds. No question.
And right, and you mentioned the stigma of even addressing it, and it's easy to address a broken bone or a gunshot wound because it's so physical and you can see the healing. You can't see the healing with the brain, and you can't see the damage on the brain. And for whatever reason, I don't even know when this started, it became a weakness. So it's so hard to change that when, especially in your profession, that can't even be talked about without the perception being you're not fit for the job, right?
Yeah, I mean, it can and is used against you.
Yeah. Seems like it's embedded in the culture to not have any emotional issues or anything but physical injuries.
Yeah, it's that whole dirty, hairy mentality where you keep everything inside and you just run with it, and I've said this before, Dirty Harry would be suspended before lunchtime, in today's world. It has to come out in the open. There has to be better programs in place with every department, every agency, where you're allowed to go in and speak with professionals, people who've been there, your peers included, therapists, who can help you without the specifics being disclosed, to your supervision.
Absolutely. And is that still a problem, or are things getting better in that department?
I think there's more realization in both law enforcement and the military, and I think things might be getting better. But all these employee assistant programs, these EAPs, they need to be revamped, and they just need better personnel with better training. Maybe bring in not only the professional therapists, but bring in some retired people who've been there and done that, and pay them to help out.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned how politics has seeped into law enforcement. What does that do to further the divide between the perception that we have and the reality of it? Because it takes me a second to say, well, how does politics factor into this?
To me, if you look at recent events, and when I even the Capitol Hill officers up there, that to me was just pure political theater. A lot of things going on with the FBI right now seem to be very politically motivated. You have chief of police in big cities who seem more concerned about the politics of the day, and maybe their resumes and where their resumes are going to lead them in the future than they do about taking care of their own troops. Politics has no place in law enforcement. The laws are the laws. They have to be enforced with common sense and with no regard whatsoever to politics, because it's only going to muddy the waters, and bad things are going to happen.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about your career? And I'm always fascinated by undercover work and how someone gets into that, and then the identity that you come up with. How in the world do you create that? I actually have acting training, so I'm fascinated by this angle of it, because there's a lot of acting that you have to do in undercover work, I imagine.
Yeah, it is your job essentially is to befriend and then betray. So you have to act like you're someone else. But I've always said you got to keep everything as close to home as possible in your undercover role to make things more real. I never went in undercover and tried to talk like someone who I wasn't, or act like someone who I wasn't, depending on who I was infiltrating, because to me that's not believable. When I see someone on the street who's doing that, first, poser, right? It's the first thing I think. So I always kept everything as close to home. And I think and all the great guys who I work with and girls, that's how they did it. And to me, that's the way to go. Don't try to be someone else. Make your undercover identity as close to your own real identity as possible to keep things real. All right. Because if I'm, trying to infiltrate the Latin Kings, or, some group that's pretty, ethnically homogenous. I'm not going to try and act like I'm a Mexican guy, right? And talk like that. I'm going to be who I am. I have my hustle going. I want to make them feel like they want to be a part of my hustle. But if I just try to act like one of them, they'll see right through that. And they're not going to hang out with me, or they're not going to deal with me.
That's interesting, because there's two dangers to that. If you try to act like you're part of their world, then you risk having that act falter a little bit, and they can identify you as a fraud, and that's dangerous for you. But it's also dangerous for you to toe the line so delicately between your own personality and the person you're pretending to be, which is essentially just a new name kind of at that point, because you're trying to be as close to you as possible. I applaud you for being able to separate the two and identify that that's not really me, but it's pretty close to me, but I wouldn't do certain things. Like, there is a job that I'm doing here, because I personally don't know if I would be able to do that. I always look at method actors and I'm like, how do you do that? Like, that is too much in my brain to comprehend how you can make that separation. So it's an incredible feat on your end.
Well, I'd say the ATF Undercover program is number one in the world, in my opinion, top notch. And, they were great about letting us do that. And they didn't assign you a name and an identity. You were allowed to choose something that you're comfortable with, because if you're not comfortable with your backstopping when you're going into a long-term undercover situation, you're done. You're not going to make it. So we were allowed to choose our own names, and I chose names. I grew up in very Italian community. I chose names from my childhood, people who I knew, names I was familiar with, and kind of helped create my own identity and did a lot of the backstopping myself. We all did that. And, they did obviously the things that we could not do: credit histories, the driver's licenses, social security cards, passports, all of that. But all the other stuff, and I kind of worked I saw the era, I came on in 91 when there wasn't really, you couldn't really go on the internet and find everything out about somebody, right? I saw the transition into that. But now there's a lot more to do than there was when I started, as far as creating your identity and your blueprint now in this world of the internet. So now it's gotten really complicated.
Yeah, and I suppose people could Google or run background checks on any name that you create at this point, but that's probably not, maybe I'm mistaken, but is that happening as much, or it wasn't a while ago, and it's sort of more of a risk now?
Oh, it's definitely more of a risk because there's so much more to cover. When I came on, these criminal organizations would do things routinely, like they would hire a private investigator to check you out. But again, you didn't have your identity didn't have such a blueprint as it does today because of the internet and accessibility. So once all this started happening, we kind of had to adjust, and from just doing simple everyday things, everywhere I went, I would fill out a magazine subscription to Sal Nunziata, which was my last undercover identity. I would enter contests. I would do all sorts of stuff just to create a bigger blueprint for Sal Nunziata. I was getting magazines mailed to me. I was doing surveys, entering all sorts of stuff so that, I was a real person. When you looked me up, I was a real person. So there was a lot, and joining gyms, joining groups, clubs, whatever, we would do all that just to leave that blueprint. So when you were checked out, by some criminal organization, they would see a real person.
Wow. I don't believe you joined a gym, first of all, but second of all, was that advice you got in your training, or was that something that you decided to do, or something that you sort of network, your network talks about?
That's straight up network, man. The guys and girls that I work with, just top notch, and we all fed off of each other, and we talk constantly, about things that we had done right, things that we had done wrong, wanted to make sure no one else made the same mistakes we made, and wanted to make sure that everyone enjoyed the successes we had. So we had a network letting each other constantly know, whether it was at a conference or just phone calls, hey, this is a good idea. This is a bad idea. To address the wardrobe issue, this is, we call this the Italian smoking jacket right here. And it's kind of been my uniform for, when I do shows and podcasts. So.
Well, Tim was going to wear his, but I was like, that's not your thing, Tim. That's not your thing. Let Lou do his thing. You do your thing.
I just didn't want to show you up.
Tim, you got to be you, right? Don't try to be someone else.
That's right. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Well, how many identities did you create? So Sal Nunziato was one. Was that a name that you had heard of before, like a last name you had heard of, or was that kind of just something you created? And how many more did you create?
Nunziato was a name of a family, kids I knew growing up. I just liked the name. My first one was Louis Tedesco. And again, Tedesco was a name of a family I knew growing up. I think I had 3. And again, I always kept it close to home. I chose my own real first name for my undercover identity when I first started, which just for the obvious reasons, right? If someone says your name, you turn around, and then I kind of evolved. I think I had 3 undercover identities during my almost 2-decade run as an undercover agent.
Almost 20 years as an undercover agent for the ATF. How does one even start that? Did you volunteer for that, or was there an assignment?
It's purely voluntary. I started out in Los Angeles as a special agent with INS, which is now ICE, which was great. It was a great experience. Learned how to be a cop, worked the streets. I was on an LAPD task force with ATF and INS, which is when I really first saw the ATF guys. And I was like, that's who I want to be. They were the cowboys. They were the guys doing the undercover. And then I did a short stint with the U.S. Marshals. It was very hard to get into ATF, small agency that wasn't doing a lot of hiring back then in the 90s. And when I finally got on, they gave you your top 3 choices of cities to go to. And I picked New York, Miami, and LA because I wanted to be in the thick of things. And those are generally cities that a lot of agents are trying to get out of, after working there for a while. So I figured I was a shoo-in, and they hired me. They gave me a job offer in Savannah, Georgia, which, I was going to take it no matter what. But, I was kind of wondering why they would put me in Savannah, Georgia. But I was very lucky. My partner, who I got, was an undercover guy. He had done undercover for years, kind of a psychopath, taught me a lot. And I started working undercover like the first week I was on the job at ATF. Before I even went to the ATF Academy, I was working undercover. So I got into it right away because I wanted to do it. And I had the opportunity because my partner was an undercover guy. And I hit the ground running, man. And once I got a little taste of it, once I started doing like the nickel and dime, dope buys and the gun buys in a public restaurant and a fast food joint, man, I was hooked. And I knew I wanted to work my way on that national scene, travel around and do long-term undercover operations.
So what is it that sort of drove you to that point? It's like the adrenaline that you get when sort of pretending to be somebody else. I imagine you probably don't get too nervous in those situations like other people would. I guess what is it?
So everyone is different, right? But undercover work to me was crack cocaine, man. It was totally addictive. I wanted to do it. I knew I wanted to do it. The whole reason I got into federal law enforcement was because I just had a chance meeting with a guy who was an undercover DEA agent. He was the brother of a guy I played football with in college. And I talked to him for about a half hour, and that was it. I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And by the time, there wasn't really an opportunity with INS, right, for a big Italian guy to do undercover work. So by the time I worked my way over to ATF, I was ready. I had been in the system. I'd been an agent for 7 years. And, once I got that first taste of it, I was hooked, man. And it actually became, I never said no to any offer to do undercover. Whenever someone called, they needed an undercover guy, I stepped up and volunteered. And it really did become an addiction for me, to the detriment of my personal life, my family life, my friends. It's what I wanted to do. I was good at it. I found something I was good at and I loved it. And I had great results. And I drove it right into the ground like a lot of us undercovers do.
And I really want to talk about the results that you got during your time being undercover. But you said something before about the person who you were partnered with being a kind of a psychopath. Is he really, or is that?
Oh, he was kind of a psychopath. He definitely was. I would love to see him get tested, right, by professionals to see and we talk weekly, but he's crazy. He's still in law enforcement, and it's just in a system. You can't get out of it. But you ask anyone who ever worked with him, and they'll tell you he's got serious issues. But incredible undercover, taught me so much.
That's interesting. And you also just mentioned you accomplished a lot. How many weapons did you take off the streets?
So I don't have like an exact number, but it was over that I personally took off. It was over 1,000 crime guns off the street in my career.
And those are guns that had been used in crimes before?
So a crime gun is considered any gun really that has left the legal marketplace and entered into the illegal marketplace. So that could be a stolen gun. It could be a gun that is possessed by someone who's prohibited, a convicted felon, an illegal alien. It could be a gun that is in and of itself illegal, a sawed-off shotgun, a sawed-off rifle, an unregistered machine gun. Those are all a crime gun that is not legal. A crime gun is a gun that is not legally possessed.
Okay. And what were some of the methods in which you removed these crime guns? Because this is fascinating to me.
So for me, there was one method that was purchasing them in an undercover capacity. And when it came to drugs, I mean, I couldn't even tell you how much. I bought more drugs in my career than I could ever remember, and which everyone has. Buying drugs was easy, man. I got to the point where I could have put a uniform on and still bought drugs. There is an art to buying guns. It is much more difficult. Anyone can buy dope. What we do as ATF, we end up buying a lot of drugs, even though that's not our primary mission, right? The DEA, for the most part, covers that. But where you have guns, you have drugs. Where you have drugs, you have guns. They go hand in hand. And we tried not to, overstep, but we bought a ton of drugs. And, does the DEA end up getting a bunch of guns? Absolutely. Just because they go hand in hand. And, once you get into that world, that gun trafficking world, and you start to understand it, you start to get a feeling, for how to find these guns and get them off the street through, using your informants, using your intelligence, and targeting those areas where the illegal guns are coming from.
And was there ever a moment in your undercover work where you were found out, or you thought you were found out?
You get that burn syndrome a lot when you're doing these long-term undercovers. We call it a burn syndrome. A lot of times you think you are, just because of little things that your targets might say, because you got some paranoia going usually. There was a time doing a long-term undercover where it was a storefront operation, and our steadfast rule at this point was not to leave the storefront. I was doing it in my hometown. Bad things always happen when we left. We did all our deals at the storefront because it obviously minimized the chances of being recognized by someone you might know. And I broke the rule. I went to the bad guy's place of business, which happened to be a car wash. And I ran into a guy there he was there scoring dope because the car wash was selling dope. And he actually was a security guard at the courthouse. He recognized me and he tipped off the bad guy.
Okay, how did you see that? How did you see that go down? How did that information come back to you?
So I didn't, when I knew something was up, I saw him and I couldn't place him. Usually they wear the blue jackets and all that. He was in civilian clothes. I couldn't place him, but we looked at each other. I knew there was something there. I told my partner afterward, I said, man, something's not right. I feel like I know that guy who was there. He was looking at me funny. And we had an informant on that operation. We go to lunch, and a few minutes later at lunch, my informant calls me and he's like, hey, man, talking about the bad guy whose name was Tony. Tony just called me and said that he just heard you were an undercover agent. There was a guy there who told him you were an undercover agent and he's seen you at the courthouse a bunch of times. So and this was a long-term operation and we were like maybe in the middle of it. So, of course I felt terrible, right? Because you don't do these operations by yourself. There's a whole bunch of agents involved and cops we were working with and people had put in a ton of time. And you don't ever want to be the reason why the whole operation has to end early or has gone south. So you got to do your best when you hear something like that to handle it and keep the operation moving forward.
So instead of just removing yourself, you stayed and said that that's untrue?
Yeah, on this occasion, I called the bad guy and I told him in different kind of terminology that it wasn't true and to call that guy back right now and that we were going to have a face-to-face. Then I hung up on him and I got my undercover car and I drove over there. And, I was boiling, man. I actually got the bad guy, and I took my wallet, my ID out. I gave him my wallet and I said, look at this shit. And I said, I told him, I said, listen, no one accuses me of being a fucking cop, right? I said, get him back here right now and I'll whoop his ass right here in front of you. Blah, and I went on and on like that. And the bad guy was like, listen, man, it's not a problem. I believe you, blah, blah, blah. And then we actually called that guy into the office. We pulled him, the guy who had given me up. And, my supervisor, read him the riot act and all that. And the operation continued. So we covered it. There was another time when I was in Chicago doing a long term on a kind of a mafia case. And the guy recognized I was wearing the backup recorder was a watch that my agency had provided for me. And I was very uncomfortable with it because it was very thick for a watch, because they had this recording equipment in it. And this guy happened to be a jeweler of all things. And he kept staring at it. He goes, man, what's going on? What's that watch, man? Let me see that. And I'm like, Jesus, are you kidding me? And, this operation, we were in like a back room where there's no way anyone could get to me. I couldn't even wear a transmitter because he had all these transmitter detection things going on. He was a major guy. So I handed him the watch and he's checking it out and looking at it, gives it back to me. We saw him because we had some hidden cameras installed. We saw him after Googling, looking up the watch and all that. So I go on Google afterward and I look up this watch, the brand name of it. And the first thing that comes up is Spy Gear. And I was like, man, they couldn't have done any better than that, huh? But again, we ended up, we got around that one too.
Like stunned.
I'm sure you were probably upset at who provided you the watch, but afterwards, do you look back on those kind of moments and you're like, that was fucking awesome? Or are you like, oh, that was shitty and I hope to never be an experience like that again?
I say that was shitty and I hope to never be in that experience again. But how we covered that one was my guy, Chris Bayless, who was kind of my undercover mentor. He went and got another one of those watches. He had it made by the manufacturer, but with no recording device in it, just a watch. Wow. And so the next time I went back there, the guy was really hinked up. I took the watch off and gave it to him. I said, hey man, you were so interested in this watch. Seems like you like it. You can have it. And I gave it to him. So I'm sure he checked it out after that and didn't find any device in it, but again, this is that network I was telling you about, with your other undercover brothers and sisters, and how we covered for each other and helped each other out.
I mean, to have to think like that so fast, like on your toes, like to make those decisions when, I mean, you described it as like kind of a mafia organization, just being in the presence of those types of people, and then they request to see the thing that is the surveillance device, like the recording device. I mean, was there ever any thought in your head, like, I got to make up an excuse as to why I can't give him this watch, but no, I can't do that because then I'm making a scene? Like, how fast do these thoughts process?
We call these oh shit moments. That's what we call them. And
accurate.
They happen, right? If you're doing a long term, right? If you're in it for a year, 2 years, it's going to happen. So, you're talking about it being an actor. Well, an undercover, you have to be the ultimate improv actor, right? Because you don't get another take. You know what I mean? It's not to be dramatic, but it can be life or death. So you have to think on your feet, and you have to be very confident about it, very sure of yourself, and you got to do it instantly. So I carried myself as an undercover agent the same way that I carried myself growing up and in life. That's how I was. So when you're in that mode, these are street guys, right? That you're dealing with. And they might not have college degrees, but a lot of them are very smart people, very sharp. And, they know how to handle themselves verbally, physically, they survive on the street. And, if you're not up to that, they're going to sniff you out.
I mean, in a moment like that, what are the odds that this might be a horrible question, but were you thinking as he's looking at that watch, if he finds something in that watch, what am I going to do? What are the odds that you make it out of that situation, that you can explain yourself out of the situation if he discovers what that watch actually was?
I mean, I would say at that point, if you found a recording device, the gig is up, right? The gig is up. He's making you either for an informant or an undercover cop. All the fast talking in the world might not help you at that point. Luckily he didn't have the material right there to break that watch down and take it apart. So I played it off like, hey man, you like the fucking watch? Here it is, right? Take a look. And that's, again, that goes back to having that, you have to have that level of confidence. And sometimes hopefully you get a little bit of luck that goes along with that.
Whew.
Well, I'll tell you, if you forget your line on stage, it feels like life or death there for a moment, but it's not. Wow. Well, so tell me about your nerves, right? Have you taken like polygraphs for your work, and they're like, oh yeah, this doesn't work on you. Like, how do you? I can't even imagine being in that situation and not like shaking and just like stuttering. How in the world do you have the nerves of steel? I mean, do you just not have nerves?
That really is an interesting question. I was never nervous working undercover, walking into situations. I was never stupid about it, right? I was never overly confident, and I never went into it like, oh man, I've been doing this now for 10 years. I was cautious and I was smart about it. I never got nervous. I don't know why that is. It wasn't something that made me anxious or nervous. It felt very natural to me. But again, I never let that seep into any kind of false confidence, because my biggest concern, and the biggest concern of all the undercovers I worked with, was always that the deal you were going into was going to be a rip, right? Because the biggest danger of working undercover is not that the bad guys are going to find out who you are, okay? Because 9 times out of 10, if the group you're working on finds out who you are, whether it's an outlaw motorcycle gang or a street gang or the mafia, they are going to distance themselves as much as they can from you. They don't want to bring heat on themselves or the organization, right? They're going to run as fast as they can, get away from you, cut off all communication. The danger of working undercover is that they do believe you, and they believe you so much that at some point they decide to kill you, because bad guys kill each other all the time over these deals, right? So if I'm buying three kilos of cocaine, from a cartel guy or someone who's dealing with the cartel, he might decide on our fourth deal that he's just going to rip me, right? I say I'm bringing $50,000. Well, on that day, he's decided I'm just going to take the money. I'm not going to give him the drug. I'm just going to shoot him in the face, take his money, and go about my way. That is the biggest danger of working undercover. So I was always super aware that every deal I was going into might be a rip, and prepared for that. We prepare for that by training and by keeping our senses heightened for that, because you never know. You could deal with a guy 10 times, and that 11th time, for whatever reason, he decides he's going to rip you, because that's what they do. They do it to each other all the time. That old "no honor among thieves" is the truest saying I've ever heard. And, that was a danger of working undercover. So as long as you kept your situational awareness when it came to being ripped off in a deal, you had a good chance of having a lengthy undercover career. As soon as you start to feel like, you got this, you got it nailed down, that's the time to get out of undercover work.
And you said that this was something that you prepared for going into it. Is this something that's sort of like officially in place in training by the ATF? Is that something that they prepare you for, or it's not like something you kind of learn on the spot?
Now we do with our SRT, which is our SWAT team. We go over all these scenarios. Rips in close quarter, small areas, rips in cars, all different environments, and what to do, how to handle it, how to survive. How to go home alive.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. So it's teamwork, the undercover thing. Obviously, the win or getting an arrest or a conviction is what you're there for. Have you ever seen someone on your team who was just not good at the undercover thing, and you had to tell them or tell someone else, like, you got to get this person off of this, they're going to F it up?
Well, undercover work was voluntary, right? No one, a supervisor never went up to an agent and said, you have to do this. Right? It's purely voluntary. Have I seen agents who were probably not suited for it, who wanted to do it but weren't suited for it? Yes. But usually that filters out on its own really quickly.
Yeah.
And again, and this is another thing that I've always said, your look is not that important, right? You can grow your hair long and cover yourself with tattoos, get 10 earrings in each ear and do all that. That doesn't make you a good undercover. Anyone can do that. It's about your game. It's about your hustle. It's about what to say, when to say it, how to say it, what not to say. Just a feeling, what you put off. Can you make other people want to be a part of your hustle, right? Do you have that characteristic? So if you're not good at it, that will show right away. And, I've never told anyone, hey, don't do undercover, you suck. But I've been around when supervisors have had to tell agents, listen, you're probably not cut out for this. Let's look at something else. Maybe be a canine handler. I don't know. Right.
And at some point, you decided that you were going to write a book about all this. And this book is due out, I believe, in December, correct?
Correct.
What did you think was appropriate for the book? And how did you, because the difference between being undercover and doing what you did and writing a book and having a podcast, I can imagine there's not a whole lot of similarities there as far as the adrenaline rush. And,
oh, come on.
How did you handle that transition?
Well, it was actually Bootsy who talked me into writing a book, and it was more for my mental health than it
Oh,
was
wow.
for, having a book. After my career had ended, it did not end well. Bootsy came to me and said, "Listen, man, you need to write a book. You've done some crazy stuff. You've done things that no one has ever done, and you should write about it." And he was kind of directing me to do that more as a mental exercise. So I started writing it, and I started writing it in 2016, and it's taken me this long. I've been through 5 co-authors. I finally found the right guy, and it just, man, I have a lot of respect for writers, because I can't tell you how many hours I've spent in front of my computer with my hands like this, thinking, because I couldn't even figure out the next word. Writing extremely difficult, man. Just, when people say, "Oh, I'm going to write a book," there's so much to it, and so much I really didn't understand. And I have such a great respect for writers. It's just so difficult to. I mean, I guess anyone could write a book, but to write a book that someone wants to read is what I'm talking about. It was so difficult. So it started out as a mental health exercise, but it kind of ended up taking on its own life. And I got a literary agent, and when he started putting it out, I started getting a lot of interest. The publisher picked it up, and then we started getting interest from Hollywood producers and media people. So it's kind of taken on a life of its own, and it just seems to be growing right now.
Well, yeah, congratulations on that. Congratulations for figuring out the process, because, I mean, just the writing part alone is tough, but also the solitude of the whole thing is tough. You have to just go within yourself, and you have to be alone, and you have to take time and focus on these things, these items that you experience and you're putting into your words. It's so solitary and so different from what you've done in the past, I would imagine. But thinking about it on a therapeutic level, it must have been great. I mean, did you have a release of? Did it do anything for you, like therapeutically, like that? The intent was.
It's funny, because I really started questioning myself. It was humbling. I would write a sentence, stare at it for 20 minutes, think it in my mind, and I'd be like, "Oh man, that sounds stupid." I'd delete it. I'd go back and say, "That sounds stupid." I'd write another one. So I found myself doubting myself and judging myself, based on what I was writing. And, with my biggest fear, I guess it is, being that I didn't want to write anything that someone would read and say either that's just stupid, or this guy's just full of himself. So it was very important for me that the book came out not as a guy who's a big chest pounder, because I cover in my book how I got into this. The book is about my storefront operations, but you can't just go right into a storefront operation. You got to build into it. So, there's a part of it about how I got into all this, but it is not a self-congratulatory book. It's a book about someone who finally figured out what he wanted to do with his life, and who was able to do it, and who had a lot of success, great success in what he was doing, and then managed to kind of lose his moral compass and not realize what his priorities should be, and had a great fall, who made mistakes and fell, and, kind of tarnished that reputation that I had and all the achievements that I had. And then who at the very end kind of came out of it and got back on his feet.
Yeah, I can't wait to check this book out, because it is such a classic story of someone. I mean, you just said it best right there. Somebody who found something that they were extremely good at, they were proficient at, they were successful, and then they fell. And like that's the classic story. And then they redeemed themselves, and they came out of it with a greater purpose and more knowledge. And I mean, that's just the classic story of any modern day hero, or not to make it uncomfortable, but like that's sort of what it is. If you're looking at like literary history, it's a modern day hero story. You put yourself in the fire and it burned you and you came out better.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's not a tough guy book. It's not a book, about some, I see so many of these shows, and I've read books about, that cop, he keeps everything inside, and, he always gets the job done, rides off into the sunset. And, it's not like that at all. It's about conflict, working undercover, as far as spending so much time with people, developing relationships, and then betraying. And these operations were very different because we not only befriended and got in with the criminals in these communities, but some of these storefronts were open to the public. And, we had people coming in, we developed relationships with people in these cities and towns. And some of these people at the end, when they found out this was a government sting operation, they were pissed off and they felt betrayed. And we talk about that. We actually hired a guy in one of these operations who was a future defendant, who was a multi-convicted felon who had already sold us a whole bunch of dope. And we ended up hiring him to work in the store with us. And we all became attached to him, and he became a fixture in our storefront. And he thought we were hustlers and bad guys, and we all became very attached to him. And there was a lot of self-doubt and turmoil at the end when we realized, man, this guy's going away for 20 years, and we had befriended him. Even the guys in the cover room felt bad about it. This guy told us we were some of the only people he had ever trusted in his whole life. During the operation, while we were playing pool, we were looking at each other like, man, you picked the wrong people to trust, because we're about to burn you. And and it's those kind of stories, that kind of get inside what it's really like to do these long-term undercover operations. And these storefront operations, people don't know about them. I'm kind of putting this out there. This is the first time they've ever been talked about. So this is new. And, I think I'm hoping people are going to be fascinated by what happened. We took a lot of crime guns off the street. We took a lot of drugs off the street. We took a lot of violent criminals off the street. But we made a lot of mistakes.
Wow. Yeah, I think based on your career, I feel like you've got a ton of stories to tell that would make the book entertaining. But the fact that you're sort of putting in your fall as well, I think it kind of makes it like epic in that way, because you could have easily not put that in, and the book would be good and entertaining. But now that it's in there, that's three-dimensional, and that brings it to a whole nother level.
Yeah, I don't run away from it. I'm not proud of it, for sure. I'm not proud of it, but it is what it is. I got to this place, where I was at the time. It happened. So I don't run from it. I retired with honors from ATF, and a great letter from the director thanking me for all these undercover operations and all that. But I had made my mistakes, and I had a lot of I ate a lot of humble pie, at the end of my career. Like I said, I lost my priorities. My priorities should have always been my family, and they weren't. So there was a lot of humble pie that I had to eat, and I think it made me turned me out a better person.
You said that the storefront operations were relatively new and a bit controversial. I don't know how much you can talk about it or want to talk about it, but I think I might have wrongfully assumed that more people knew about this. Can you explain what the storefront operations are or were, and how that got started?
Yes. And again, I'll say this, the reason I'm coming out, but there will never be another storefront operation. ATF doesn't do them anymore. Congress got sideways with these operations. So a storefront operation is a fictitious business that is owned and operated by law enforcement, okay, for the purpose of reducing crime in that community. Essentially, you create a venue for criminal activity in a community, but we didn't just like drop these out of the sky into a random place. we identified, usually almost always in the ones I did, it was because of requests from the local police to address violent crime, to address the gun crimes, gun-related crimes, in certain areas, certain cities, certain parts of certain cities. A storefront investigation is an investigative tool to address these issues. So I would go in as Sal Nunziato and I would start a business, and I would do it all from scratch, because you couldn't pull favors and, say, hey, can go to the local police or go to City Hall, can you pull me this permit? We did it from the ground up. Sal Nunziato would go to this city and I would meet with realtors. I would find a place. I would deal with the permits, City Hall as Sal Nunziato, the fire marshals, code people, all that. And we would then we would have our tech guys come in and line the counters with Kevlar, hidden ballistic material, and, microphones and cameras everywhere. We would have a team of undercovers. We would have a cover team that was usually in an adjacent room somewhere, who could come in with long guns and cover us, during an armed robbery or whatever. And we would set these, it was labor intensive. There was a lot of work. We would get them set up. Then we would get the word out in the community that we were hustlers. My hustle was always the same. I was from New York, and I had mobster associates up there who would buy guns from me, and we would get them down here and we would bring them up to New York and make a huge profit, which is what people really do. That is what gun trafficking is, and it happens routinely. So that was our excuse for buying all these guns. And the bad guys knew that this was a legitimate practice that happens. And again, the buying dope was easy. We ended up getting into some other things, stolen cars, but it was mostly about the guns. And we would set these operations up, and they would kind of spiderweb. All right. They would take on their own life, and we would get into different organizations, different gangs, and we would end up charging conspiracies, RICO charges on these different gangs, different criminal organizations that we were working, that would come into us. And the best part about it to me was that we were doing it in a controlled environment, as controlled as on any undercover transaction can be. You can't control the bad guys and their actions, but we were able to control everything else, as opposed to when I used to go and meet a bad guy, in a parking lot and have to get in his car to buy a gun, or at a fast food restaurant or an alleyway or a car wash. Now at least we were able to control the venue. They were coming to us in a venue we controlled. We had our cover team. We had our cameras. I didn't have to worry about wearing anything at this point because everything was already installed. So it was a great venue for undercover work. Again, you can never control everything, but as much as could possibly be controlled was controlled, which was a big reason for the success.
And that was where you got a lot of the guns off the street, a lot of the drugs off the street, and all of that's turned over to whatever government agency? Was that all that turned over to the ATF?
Yeah, well, they were our first operation we did in Augusta, Georgia. We bought over 400 crime guns off the street. And what happens, those are all destroyed.
Oh, right.
Yeah, obviously as ATF, those guns go into our evidence vault. Even the drugs go into our evidence vault. Everything is destroyed. When all the cases are adjudicated, all the evidence is destroyed. So, ATF doesn't put those guns back out on the street or anything like that. Those guns are all destroyed at the end of the case.
Oh, good for you. That's amazing. And you just said that this was you had one in Augusta, Georgia, and you took 400 guns off the street. No one ever talks about Augusta, Georgia being associated with a crime city.
Yep.
What were some of the more surprising cities that had a lot of crime in your experience?
We did these in some small cities in Georgia where I didn't have a lot of high expectations. And we were Statesboro, Georgia, where Georgia Southern University is, not a big town at all. And we bought 245 crime guns off the street. The ones we did in bigger cities, a great tattoo shop was, I think it was Hustler Inc., was in Las Vegas. Some great warehouse operations out in Los Angeles were done. But I think one of the biggest surprises was these small southeastern cities that we did some of these operations in, and we're still buying 250 to 300 guns in a 9-month period off the street. Some of my partners down in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Miami area, did some that were very identical almost to the ones we were doing, and they had incredible success down there. But again, not a huge surprise, in the Miami area. But some of these were popping up in small towns, in West Virginia, in Georgia, South Carolina, and just incredible success because, man, the guns are just falling out of the trees out there. And, I'm talking about stolen guns. I'm talking about crime guns. So the results were really good.
And since then, the storefront operations have been they're no longer in existence.
Nope.
Was there an alternative put into place?
No.
Ah.
I feel like in the last couple of years, undercover work has really decreased. I can't give you a percentage, but it's really decreased. Agencies are scared, I think, hesitant might be a better word, to go out there, and they're just worried about public perception. Undercover work is a gray area. There's no way around it. It is a gray area. Sometimes you do what you have to do so you go home at night. You do what you have to do to survive. And I think agencies and police departments are less inclined these days to take those risks. And it's a shame because undercover work gets you where other police work cannot get you. It gets you access into the criminal world where access you can't get, not even through an informant sometimes. And I hate it, but that is the environment we're in now.
Wow, what an amazing conversation and an amazing life that you've lived, and you're continuing to do amazing things with the book and the podcast. And is Sal your final undercover identity that you anticipate? Sal from Bootsy and Sal, End of Watch?
Yeah, Sal Nunziato is Lou Valoze is retired. Sal Nunziato is dead. The way I look at it, that chapter of my life is over. I use the name for the podcast still because we always called each other by undercover names, the undercover crew, which just was something we did, but it also was very useful because you get used to hearing your undercover name being addressed by it and calling it. So, to this day, almost all the guys I work with are all retired, but to this day, we still call each other by our undercover names. So I'll keep the name alive, but the character is dead.
How did Sal die?
Well, the way I look at it, I created Sal, and, at the end of my career, when I kind of got blown out of the water and all that, I killed Sal. That's it. That's how I kind of turned the page and started the new chapter in my life.
And is there a particular resource that you can put out there to the public? I mean, if anyone was listening anyone who's trying to deal with any sort of PTSD from being in law enforcement, where do they reach out to? Is there what resource can you provide to them?
I haven't officially joined any organization. We discuss it at length, on all of our podcasts. But there are organizations out there. A guy named Tom Satterley, who's a former Special Forces guy, has one called the All Secure Foundation. Eddie, the former Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, has one called the Pipe Hitter Foundation. So all you got to do is you just Google these foundations, and they're out there. They're out there just helping current and former, military, law enforcement, first responders who need help. You can call them, you can talk to them. I think the bigger, you asked me if things have changed, and if they are changing. I think they are changing in that there are way more organizations out there now that are just willing to listen. And sometimes you just need to talk about it. I never talked about it until the end, until I was told and convinced that I should go in and get some therapy. And then I started talking about it, and it all just poured out. Because, obviously I wasn't talking about it with my family or with anybody. And, once you start talking about it, that might be the difference right there. Just now that you put a slit in it, you let some air come out. That might be the difference in you not putting that gun up to your head and just starting to let it out in a different way.
Was that an easier way for you to write the book, to speak about these stories, as opposed to sitting there and typing?
It really was. And, doing podcasts like I'm doing right now with you guys is a way for me. I actually enjoy talking about it. Like I said, I'm proud of what I've done. Certainly not proud of the mistakes I made, but I don't run from them, and the more you talk about things, I've learned this. And trust me, guys, this is coming from a guy who, for the first 45 years of my life, I didn't talk to anybody about any of this. I almost saw it as a sign of weakness, but now I find it therapeutic. And I hope that I'm helping people. I hope that people who listen to your podcast hear this, and maybe someone who's going through something, will say, wow, I can relate to that. Maybe I'll reach out. Maybe I'll watch some more podcasts. And it's helpful. And, I'm glad I'm doing it. And every show, every podcast I do like this, to me, is very therapeutic.
Awesome. We're glad you're doing it as well. And we'll put the link to the Pipe Hitters Foundation and the All Secure Foundation in the show notes. And what is the title of this book that'll be coming out in December? Did I get the date right?
It'll be out in December. My publisher is McFarland, and they still haven't settled on the exact title, but for sure, Storefront will be the title. And again, the book is centered around these storefront operations. And I go through almost like different seasons. I go through the different storefront operations and the crazy shit that happened during all them, the ups and the downs, and what we did right, what we did wrong, how they turned out, all the way up until, when the SWAT team comes in and was banging doors down and taking these guys into custody, and the chases and the shootouts and all that. So it'll definitely be called Storefront. There'll probably be a little variation behind it, Life Undercover, something like that. But it's the only book out about it. So I'm hoping if you Google Storefront, it'll come up.
Cool. And everyone's going to fully anticipate Tim Pilleri playing you in the movie, because the similarities are just uncanny, and he could really pull it off. He's a serious method actor.
Yeah.
I see it. I definitely see it.